Now we can start. Okay, so today's topic is backups. Now I've got a couple of videos in this talk. There's not many slides, so I'm thinking that if there's any comments during the talk, then just put your normal hand up in Zoom, and then we can pause and see if there's an interesting point or discussion to raise. So this is what I plan to go through on backup. So introduction, bit of an outline of some things that can go wrong, um, and the reasons why you want backups, I suppose. A few different elements that might go into your backup strategy. Usually, when you're thinking about backups, you're going to take two or three ideas, merge them together to produce your backup plan. So we're going to talk about, a few actually independent and separate topics that you probably want to mix and match to come up with your own backup strategy. Some examples and tooling. Now, I am going to describe what I do in a bit more detail, but I'm going to try and make this clear probably several times. Is what I do is just an example. The backup strategy for you is, for you personally. There's no perfect or ideal ways to do these things. If you're going to, think about backups, you need to think about, what's important to you and how you need to create your backup strategy to meet your own requirements. But so what we're trying to do today is to tease out some ideas really that might trigger some thinking and that, oh, I've missed that off my backups. I need to go and, fill that hole. So let's plow on introduction. So, one of the important thing is, and often one thing that we don't do, at least if we're not working commercially, is to do some planning. Figure out what you need to do and how you're going to do it. So this is the way I sort of think about it, is to start off with what data is most important to you. For me personally, it's going to be my photographs. We talked about photo albums last month. And so, photographs is pretty important to me. But, I've also got lots of little servers with lots of detailed configurations. And although they're not vitally important to me, if I were to have to redo all that configuration again, it would be a bit of a nightmare. But also, it's not also what's important to back up, what's not important to back up. For example, I tend not to back up operating systems because if I've got a failure of some sort and have to restore from backup, I will install the operating system from the original media. I won't restore the operating system from the backup. And other people will, you make a different choice on that one. That might sound obvious, but there's very little point in doing backups unless you know how to recover from your backups. And there's an implication here to actually test your backups. You can't really say you've got a backup system unless you've actually tried to recover from it. You probably want to think about, how often and how to back up. And here's an interesting thought, which I just threw in as a bit of a left of field. When I started my career, and I used computers all the way through my career, the first day in the office, they used WordStar for a word processor.
Oh,
And then I moved on to things like DisplayWrite from IBM. I used Microsoft Word for a bit, and now I use Google Docs. So if you think about your career and the length of it and go back to the beginning, in this example, WordStar, even if I could restore that precious document that's written in WordStar, what is the chance I can actually open up that document? The thing is, file formats come and go, and also backup medias come and go. So if I was using a backup tape, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, to back up my WordStar documents, there would be very little chance I'd have the hardware to read that tape, very little chance I would have the software to read those WordStar formats. So that's another thing to think about. For example, if you're got something particularly valuable, let's pick a random example. Let's say you're into genealogy and you've got all your family trees set up and you've got this really fancy desktop application with its nice backup, there's nice database in it, and you can do all sorts of fancy things with it. What if that company goes bust and in a few years' time you won't be able to buy that application to read it? In that case, what you probably want to do as part of your backup strategy is to periodically export your family tree into a much more open format, as well as backing up, the database and such like. So you've got a better chance to be able to restore it in the future. Anyway, these are some just random thoughts about your backup planning, or our backup planning, sorry. So what's the reasons for doing backups? Obvious one is to protect against hardware failure. And traditional discs, discs that spin and make noise and whiz around, apparently they last about 4 to 7 years before they fail. SSD discs, non-spinning discs, usually a bit longer, 5 to 10 years. And actually, I no longer use these spinning discs anymore. They take too much power and take too much noise, but that's aside. But it's telling you that at some point you're going to get a hardware failure. And you know what it's like, it's always going to be at the most the most awkward point. And of course, you could have something physical that happens. A classic example is a fire, but I kind of think of a water leak. You might have a burst water tank in the loft, and you get this turn of water, and it messes up your machine, and you have to try and restore your disk from backups. But these are you're probably getting a bit more common here. Protection against software corruptions. That could be bugs. Let's say you've got you've just moved to the latest beta version of your genealogy application. You've installed it, and it's completely trashed your database. In that case, you want to go back to the backup, restore it, and restore the previous version of the software, and then carry on. But of course, you can have viruses and malware, and we'll touch on ransomware in a minute in a bit more detail. But if you imagine you've got a virus on your computer, that may well corrupt every single file on your disk. So we're not just talking about hardware failures, not talking about bugs, we're talking about, anything that can happen. But in my experience, and I was a Unix system administrator commercially for a while, by far the most common reason to want to restore from backup is you've deleted something accidentally, or someone else has deleted something accidentally. So you formatted your disk or whatever. And my personal experience is that's the most common reason to do it. And the last point, just in the introduction here, is in the past, certainly commercially and also at home, these backups have always been on tapes. And a good reason for that, tapes were cheap, but very slow. But tapes lasted a long time as well if you stored them properly. These days, the high capacity, external disks are so relatively cheap that for the purpose of this talk, we're only really talking about backing up to a second disk drive. We're considering tapes happened last century. Okay, so just a little picture of what we were just talking about. So let's say you've got your desktop computer, you've got a little USB backup drive. plugged it in, and you're doing your backup. So let's say you've got, corrupted a file on there, and then that's quite an easy. You can go to your backup drive and you can restore it back to your computer. Fine. One thing to consider, what happens if you back up that corrupted file before you manage to restore it? Oh, so now on your external drive, you've no longer got a good copy of your data. So? Here's another little scenario. Let's say you've got a good file which you backed up properly and nicely, and let's say you've deleted it on your computer. Let's do that again. We delete it on a computer, or forgot to delete that. But when you go to the drive, you find your drive no longer works. That is failed, and again, you've completely lost that file. So even though you may well be doing backups regularly, when you start to think about the sorts of failures you could get, you might see there's some holes in your backup plan, and that's really where we're coming from for today's talk. And of course, what I sort of hinted at, let's say it's the only icon I could find. Let's say your water tank in the roof bursts, and it destroys both your desktop computer and your backup. Then you're stuck. You've lost both copies. So again, these are the sorts of things you might want to consider. Now, ransomware is a particular interesting one I found. I found this nice little short video from IBM which talks about ransomware in particular. Now, before we go on this, if you're not aware, ransomware is really, I suppose, a type of malware or viruses. Someone's attacked your machine, and what they've done, they've installed some software on your machine which has encrypted your whole disk. So you've no longer got access to it. And typically what they'll do, they'll send you a message saying, yeah, I've encrypted your disk. If you pay me, 1 Bitcoin or, half a Bitcoin or whatever it is, then I'll give you the mechanism to decrypt it. Now, this is quite rare for individuals for this to happen, but it does happen a lot commercially. And although this ransomware is, a particular example, it is a case of where you might lose both your main desktop or your notebook, whatever you're backing up, and your backup. So let's listen to that tape, the video. And what I think I'll do is I'll pause after this video to see if there's any points or questions to raise.
Backing up your data is not the most exciting topic until you really need it. Once you've been hit by ransomware, you're going to wish you've done what I'm going to talk about. There are 4 different strategies that we could have for doing backups: local backups, cloud-based backups, air-gapped backups, or immutable backups. There's actually more, but I'm going to summarize it with those 4 main approaches, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of those and how they can prepare you so that when the ransomware attacker demands money, you can thumb your nose at him and go along your merry way. So the first I'll talk about is a local backup. In this case, I've got my data and I'm just going to copy it to another data source. Maybe it's a USB attached drive. It could be network attached drive, but it's essentially local to my system. And there's advantages and disadvantages to this. The pros are it's pretty fast because it's a local attachment, but the downside is it's vulnerable to ransomware. If an attacker comes along and encrypts the main source, if they have access to that, because it's locally attached, they probably have access to the backup as well. And if your backup is encrypted, then it's not going to do you any good at all. So the next approach then would be a cloud-based backup. In this case, I've got my local data and I'm going to send it off to some cloud-based storage. I don't really know where it is. I don't care. But the fact of the matter is the data is someplace else, so that when this gets encrypted, as long as I have multiple copies back here, it doesn't automatically encrypt elsewhere. It's not part of the locally attached file system in particular. So I have an advantage here of disaster recovery. For instance, if my system goes down, if it gets burned up in a fire, if there's some sort of natural disaster as well, I also have the ability to recover that from the cloud. So that's a big advantage. Now, there's other things that could be a disadvantage, and that's speed. So it's going to be slower. We've got to go across the internet in order to get the information. If you try to recover an entire system that way, you may be waiting hours, maybe days before you get all of your information back. So that's a problem. Now, yet another approach, and this is one I hear a lot of clients talk about, is doing what they refer to as an air gap. In this case, there is some sort of breakage between the two. That's what a true air gap is. A lot of people talk about air gaps, but don't really do them. As long as there is a network connection, it's not air gapped. Air gap means air. That's the only thing that can be between the two systems. So they have to be on entirely different networks for that to be the case. Now, the advantage here is if an attacker does get to this system and encrypts it, it's not going to encrypt the other because there's no connection. So this copy is still sitting there pristine. That's an advantage. It's more secure than some of the others I've talked about. What's the disadvantage? Well, it's not current. Because there's no connection there all the time, whenever I update my data, then my backup is not also updated. So it falls out of sync pretty quickly. The fourth approach that I'm going to talk to you about is called an immutable backup. An immutable backup is one where I can write only one time. So I can take my data and write it over to the other backup media. And once it's been written, it can't be written again. So this is what we also sometimes refer to as a worm drive or a worm system. Write once, read many. So I can read it as many times as I want, but no one can overwrite it. So if the ransomware attacker comes along and encrypts this source, they can't also encrypt the other because it can't be overwritten. The advantage here then is it's more secure than some of the other options I talked about. It also has the advantage of being relatively fast because it's fairly locally connected. It also has the advantage of not being vulnerable to ransomware, as I just discussed. Only real downside may be that it doesn't do some of the DR, disaster recovery type of scenarios, because it is co-located. It's near my system. But as many people would say, two backups equal really just one backup, and one backup is equal to none. You really might want to use multiples of these strategies so that you're really prepared in case you get attacked. Backing up your data is not...
Right. Let's pause it there for a moment to see if there's any questions or comments or thoughts so far. You stick your hand up or...
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry. One of the things about air gap is because I back up important files to a memory stick and then dismount it and unplug it. I'm using Apple macOS, but I don't think. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's easy to eject a device, but not unplug it. Is it still vulnerable because it's still plugged in, but you've ejected it? And is there a quick way to remount it if you don't want to be continuously unplugging and replugging?
Yeah, I mean, I actually came across this commercially, and we had a system with changed permissions. So that once the backup is done, we changed the permissions such that the backup couldn't be remounted until the next backup was due. So, you could engineer ways to actually make that drive not be accessible. Having said that, if someone attacks your machine, they're going to have complete access to your machine, you would assume. So, yeah, I mean, as far as I know, there's no mechanism that would actually just eject your drive to give you that air gap. But
No, I mean, I can control the eject, but the pain is getting to the back of the machine every time to unplug and replug. But one of the advantages of doing this is it gets around that problem of what I call self-corruption of files. Where you've cocked it up yourself, or you want to keep doing regular backups to a device with yet another device that we'd use at some other time for a sort of a more over-embracing backup.
Yeah. We'll talk some more about that. But in the particular case that the USB port is not accessible, I'll just get an extension cable so it is.
Yeah, I suppose that's the other way of doing it. Put an extension cable in, just eject it
Yeah.
physically each time, and go through that process. The other thing with backups, though, and I haven't yet. It's a long time since I've done Unix and Linux and admin. I haven't found a way on MacOS to easily find what is the latest version of the file, where it's actually located. The easy thing to do if you've got multiple backups is to end up overwriting a new file with an old file.
Yes, yeah, we'll talk a little bit about those sorts of incremental backups in a minute.
Yeah, okay.
Neil.
My apologies for jumping in, but how do you raise your hand? I don't have a control for that.
Yeah, there's at the bottom of your screen, you should find I don't have it. I've got a presentation screen. So actually,
React probably. It's still under reactive. It's
well,
not
you can just hold your hand up for a while and it should get detected.
It just says play chime or recognize hand gestures, which I've been playing on. Nothing happens.
It's under more if you're using the app. The 3 dots in a circle.
Anyway, do you speak now you've started?
Oh, sorry. Okay. If I may then, there's a couple of points. One is I was going to, if respectfully disagree with your remarks about not restoring the operating system. I'm using Windows 10. My original installation disks are now about 10 years old. If I didn't, if I didn't restore from a current backup, I'd not only have to restore the media, I'd have to restore every single update that Microsoft has issued in the last 10 years. The other thing that I haven't heard mentioned yet is the difference between just copying files and image backups, such as those made by Acronis and Semantic System Recovery, which is one I still use, even though that's 10 years old. But the advantage of those is that you can create an image of your operating system and any other disks you're using. It makes restoration, if you have to, a walk in the park. You can restore your operating system disk in maybe an hour, a couple of hours, rather than having to take a day or 2 days to recover everything. And in regards to the point made by the speaker on the video, backing up to a local drive, as far as ransomware goes, would be fine if you disconnect the drive once the backup's done.
Yeah, that last point was the same point Paul was making. That makes it an air gap in IBM's term.
Yeah, and the other thing, briefly, is I always store an off-site backup in my garage, which is a separate building to our house.
Yep, we're just about to cover that one. So, yeah, some good points. There's nothing I'm disagreeing with. As I said to start with, the point of today was to, trigger discussion. Personally, when I restore systems, it's very quick. But then again, I don't use Windows, so maybe that's why I don't have issues with restoring it. Peter, you have your hand up for some time there.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Peter. And I just a bit. He used the word cloud storage. Obviously, there's iCloud and Google Drive. Now, were they in his definition of cloud? So, if you do get a nasty virus or something to corrupt your disk drive, would it corrupt the file on iCloud and Google Drive, please?
Yeah, so the term cloud really means a computer which is managed by someone else.
Okay.
So cloud servers are, yes, Apple iCloud, Google Drive, Amazon S3 is thousands of different types of that. So it's storage space that's managed for you somewhere else.
But your files are synchronized so that if you've got multiple devices, so you've got maybe an Android tablet like I've got and operate on Windows, it's fairly seamless if I use Google Drive to access the information. Where am I at risk at that point on what's being said so far?
This slide I've got up was actually just about to cover that sort of.
Okay, stop. Peter, stop. Okay, thanks, Peter. Thank you.
Yeah. Paul.
Yeah, I just make a quick point. Apple Macs offer a thing called Time Machine, which allows you to go back in time, and it does, I think, back up the operating system, or at least the settings you've got for the operating system. But I just make the additional point: you need some form of a boot disk. So if your hard drive crashes on your, or your SSD crashes on your computer, once you've got that fixed, you're going to need some way of booting to get something to access your backup drive to be able to reinstall your OS from either there or from the cloud, or from the manufacturer.
Yes, that is true. Okay. Oh, Peter, you got your hand up again? No.
Sorry, I'll put it down. Sorry. Thank you.
Tom.
Oh, sorry. Right. Yeah. Sorry, I've got my video off. I just had to. I'm after 8 years, I'm just rebuilding my my computer, and as a planned piece of upgrading, and so I'm doing it. I'm finding I'm using Back in Time quite a lot. Back in Time on Linux enables one to browse by date a different version of my data, and so I want to get back to some of the config files, and I just browse to an older version where I know I had a reliable config at that time. And the software, it's really good because when you restore, it restores not only the file and puts it in the right place for you in the operating system configs, but it also puts the permissions, gets the permissions right, because that's I have my family share my main desktop computer, and they all have different accounts, and we have a group account for the family. So when I restore a file, I don't have to worry about all the original configs. That comes straight away. Mm-hmm. And I know someone mentioned earlier that the need to have the old original media to recreate Windows. Well, I somewhat carelessly lost my virtual Windows machine in the migration. I forgot to have a copy of it. So yesterday I just downloaded Windows 10 from website, from Microsoft's website. And the most important thing to have on a Windows computer is all the license keys. And so I have a backup of all my license keys, including Windows. Now, to get the license key for Windows is non-trivial. You do have to use a tool. You can't just read it off the screen. And so whenever I get a new computer, like I bought a new one, I got second used one on eBay, the first thing I do is run a program that extracts an inventory of all the software and operating system and all its license codes. So when I installed Windows yesterday, I just had to put in the key that I bought from them a few years ago, and I was up and running.
Yep, good points again, and some of those that you've raised, we will be covering them in slides, so you might have some follow-up points to make. So let's plow on then. You might have heard of this 3-2-1 backup. I'll call them elements. It's just like one aspects of your backups you might want to think about. So someone's been drawn on my screen. Someone's so 3-2-1. This means, so the 3 in the 3-2-1 means have 3 copies of your data. So in other words, the original copy of a data, the original data plus 2 copies. That's what the 3 stands for. 2 means on 2 different media. So 2 different disk drives. So in other words, there's no point making 3 copies of your data on the same disk drive, because if that disk drive fails, you're going to lose all 3 copies of your data. And the last one, and that point's been made, and have 1 off-site copy, whether that's in the cloud or in your garage or somewhere else. So that's what 3-2-1 stands for. And it's been around not that long actually. It wasn't the the acronym that I was using when I was working, but you'll see this quite a lot. 321, 3 copies of data on 2 different media and 1 copy off-site. There are a few variations. If I can get rid of that scribble. There's 432, which means 4 copies of your data in 3 locations, and 2 of your locations are off-site. So this is, one one more than the 321 idea. And then you get 32110, which is 3 copies of your data on 2 different media, 1 copy off-site, 1 copy offline or air-gapped. So the USB drive is unplugged, ejected, and with 0 errors. Now, this, I think, is a critical point. There's little point in you backing up if you don't test your backups. And if your backup hard disk has got some corruptions on it, you may not be able to restore. So, you've got to test your backups. So now there's another aspect to backups, which is separate to this idea of 321. And that is rotate your backups. So if you think about when you might want to restore your data, I mean, it's already come up in discussion. You might want to restore your file that you accidentally deleted an hour ago. But you might want to restore a file which you deleted, a week or a month ago. And so you probably want to figure out some way to rotate your backups. So a very simple way to describe this is, let's say on your external drive, you create a whole bunch of folders. You might have, backup/Monday. And so on Monday morning, you make a copy of all your important stuff into that folder. On Tuesday morning, you make a copy of your important stuff in the Tuesday directory, and so on and so forth. So come Thursday, let's say, and you want to restore something, you can go back to the Wednesday directory, the Tuesday directory, or the Monday directory. In other words, you've got several copies of your data on that single backup medium, but you can go backwards in time to choose which one you want to restore. And of course, you can enhance this kind of like simple concept by having month directories. So if you have a backups in January, you might take all your backups from the previous Monday and copy them into January and never delete the ones in January. But your daily backups, when you come back to the following Monday again, you delete what you backed up a week ago and then start using it again. So you cycle these directories. So you have some sort of mechanism where you can go back, one day or 1 week or 1 month or 1 year and still be able to find your file. Now, there's lots of different schemes that do this sort of stuff. And of course, there's lots of tools that will manage this for you. So you don't have to think, too hard about it. A common one from the probably from the 60s, I think, is what's called grandfather, father, son. And it's a mechanism to, refresh these directories or tapes or disks in a 3 level of cycles. There's a very complicated one, which is statistically a really good way, called the Tower of Hanoi. I've got links at the back to these if you particularly want to investigate how these works. But the point is that this idea of having rotated backups is, really actually a very good idea, but you really need a tool to manage it for you. If you're going to do this manually, you're going to make mistakes. So the third thing you want to think about, you talk about 321, we talked about having, a history of your files. Another thing is, what you want to do is how you're going to copy your backups. So you could do, as many people do, is just do it ad hoc. So you might do a lot of work on your family tree, and then when you finish that, you'll say, right, I want to take a backup now. So, it's a fair enough idea. I wish I could get rid of that Oh, I've got this. I don't know if you can see it as well, but I've got this. Someone's drawn a circle. I can't get rid of it. Maybe it's part of Zoom. So, after you've done your family tree update, you could do a backup or rename your files or copy your files to .back files and so on. And some applications will do this automatically. You save your file and it will copy the previous version into a different file just in case you lose something. Ad hoc, though, you're just going to forget, aren't you? The time you lose something is a time when you forgot you forgot to do this manual backup. And of course, you could back up all your files every day or every week. People just copy everything. So that's a simple in concept, but the downside of this, just copying everything, it just consumes an awful lot of storage. And you're going to have multiple copies of files which just don't change. An awful lot of backup mechanisms now use an incremental or reverse incremental mechanism. So this idea is when you first do your backup, let's say on the Monday, you do a full backup. Everything is copied from your desktop onto the backup medium. You've got an exact copy. But then let's say on the Tuesday, you only copy the differences. So the Tuesday backup is going to be so much faster. If you've done no work, it will just finish immediately. If you've edited a couple of documents, then all you're going to do is back up those couple of documents that you've changed. So it is a bit more complicated. You definitely need tools to do this, but it saves an awful lot on storage. And if you save more on your backup storage, it means you've got a bigger length of time to keep your backups. Now, there's a couple of ways that this works. Now, originally, it was, as I described, incremental. You do a full backup, and then every day you do an incremental backup. And this was anyway the only way you could back up commercial databases. Databases like Oracle have a mechanism to export differences. It's usually called like a log or an intent log or a snapshot. Now, if you think about we're going to restore this database, you've got one full backup from, say, a month ago, and then you've got 28 incremental backups. And to restore that in a failure, you have to go back a month, restore the full backup, and then apply the first incremental backup, then apply the second incremental backup, and apply the third. And it's called rolling forward in database terms. You roll forward your database until it's up to date. So that's the downside with incremental. But there is this reverse incremental, which actually is quite clever. It does things the other way around. So effectively, at least from a user's point of view, it looks like your most recent incremental backup is in fact a full backup. So you only ever need to restore the most recent backup. And that's how modern day backup systems like, Time Machine and Reskit work. Although you're doing this little snapshots, the latest snapshot appears to be a full backup. And we've touched on another technique, and obviously quite valid from the discussions, is to do a full disk image backup. So the nice thing about this, it works with any operating system. You just need to take a bit by bit copy of the operating system. You need disk space equivalent to the size of your disk, obviously. Now I know there's fancy Windows tools that can actually do this while Windows is running. But at least traditionally, and probably a best way to do it is when the operating system is not running. In other words, you shut your operating system down, you boot up from a special media, you do a backup of a operating system which is not running. And then to restore it, you do exactly the same as Paul was describing. You boot up from a CD or something, plug in your backup media, and then do a restore. Paul, you're going to bring some.
Yeah, just a quick one on that. Firstly, is there a way to do, I think it's ISO disk images from within the operating system, or do you normally have to restart from a different boot device first? And secondly, I don't know what the situation is now with defrag. I know in the past when I used to be a sysadmin on WinNT, unless you defragged the disk first, you ended up creating a container that included everything in it. It was a bit-for-bit copy, which can be quite inefficient.
Yes. Yes. So yes.
The modern systems defrag automatically now.
File systems, at least modern Unix file systems, don't need defragging, but that's different to the point that you're making. If you back up a disk, then you need that disk space. What you typically do, at least with Linux, is there's techniques to shrink the file system before backing up. So you back up only the part of the file system that's actually got data in, and you don't back up parts of the file system which is empty. The other point to make there, of course, if you compress the backups, then empty disk space will typically compress better, or if it's never been used, will compress better than parts of the file system which is used. But yes, I mean the points that you made will be considerations to your backup technique. I will be touching on this again, and we mentioned it last month. But if you've got running applications, particularly applications that's like got databases, and you try to back them up while those are still running, you'll almost certainly run into problems. If the files have been updated while you're doing a backup, then as the backup sweeps through stuff, you're going to get this slew, this timestamp slew. And when you restore it and try and open up the database, you find it won't open.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, how you suspend all the back. I'm assuming if you do it from within the OS, it will, apart from apps and or applications that are running, for the other stuff, for the general housekeeping that's going on in the background and the indexing and stuff, I'm assuming that gets suspended when you're creating an image. One thing I've always done in the past is disconnected from the network when I've been doing an image, unless you're trying to create an image elsewhere, via the net, because that way you stop all the interactions. If you turn your Wi-Fi off or whatever, you stop all those interactions in the background that are changing your system where you're trying to do a backup of it.
Yeah, exactly. A simple thing is to, as you were getting to, is to stop applications before you back them up. So if you've got your genealogy application, which has got a very big database, shut it down before you do a backup. The other thing to mention, I do touch on this, is that many backup systems these days are aware of many applications. Time Machine on Macs, for example, it's aware of Mac Mail. It's aware of all the Mac applications. So when Time Machine comes to back up your email, it will send the right signals to the mail system to actually stop working, or at least be safe from a backup point of view. If, however, you're using a non-Mac backup on on your Mac, then that may not be true. I'll describe what I do about backing up email, because that's always an interesting one. I'm going to mention RAID disks. So if you're not aware of this, what you can buy is a cabinet with lots of disks in them, and you can have various configurations, which means that your data is automatically mirrored, or at least copied, to 2 or more disks at once. You get your little boxes and you stick them on, and you follow the instructions to configure it. And those can be quite nice because RAID servers are tolerant of single hardware failures. So if you store all your stuff on a RAID device of 5 disks, and 1 disk fails, you're just not aware of it. You just carry on using it. And then at some point later, you can eject the failed disk, put a new good disk in, press a button on the front of the panel, and it'll sort itself out. But of course, RAID is not a backup. RAID may be part of your overall backup mechanism, but it's not a backup in its own right. It's still having this 1 copy of data. Um, so a little bit of a summary. I talked about a few different elements of backups. I talked about 3-2-1. I'll talk about, full backups, snapshot backups, and so on. And the chances are you're going to use a combination of these techniques in your own personal backup mechanism. So, for example, you might choose 3-2-1, which is, 3 copies of your data, 2 different drives and 1 offline, and also do your backups in an incremental way, and use the grandfather, father, son mechanism. And here we go. This is the way we do it. So on Monday we do a full backup to a local disk, and then copy that to a cloud on week 1. On Tuesday we do an incremental to local disks, and then copy to the cloud, and so on Wednesday. And then when we come through to the second week, then we'll make copy that to a month, and so on and so forth. So we've always got a history of your backups on 3 copies of your data, 2 separate disks, 1 in the cloud, plus you've got this history of your backups as well. And of course, these backups get written. Paul, you're going to make another point.
Yeah. When thinking about your critical data, I thought quite long and hard about this. I'm on Apple, so I've got an iPhone, an iCloud, an iPad, and a Mac.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that I thought about this some time ago. If you, and particularly on a phone where it's easy to do just by touching the wrong part of the screen by accident, if you make a cock up on something like your contacts or your favorites, or the other one, which is your calendar, the 3 things you probably use quite a lot, you can corrupt that data right across the cloud and right across your devices. So as a precaution, I always save a PDF and an exportable VCF file version of my contacts separately from the native application, because it allows you to export them. I export my bookmarks, and I also export my critical things like that to a format that you could use basically by off a memory stick, plug it in anywhere and read it.
Yep. Very good points. Very good point.
And the same would apply to Android and people using Google Drive and things like that.
So what you're saying is that your iPhone by default only gives you 2 copies of your data. Okay, 1 on the phone, 1 in the cloud, and you've done a manual step which actually gives you your 3 copies, as 3-2-1 suggests.
Yeah, it does, because if I corrupt it anywhere on any of the systems I use, it corrupts everywhere because it all syncs through the cloud, and that is something that people need to be aware of when they're using Cloud Sync. If you muck it up once somewhere, it's mucked up everywhere else. Or if you delete a contact, or you put the wrong phone number in, or whatever, something like that. There's a lot of capability with these sync systems to make a big foul up. And the problem is you'll never get out of that, really, unless you've got historical backup. The easy way to fix it is to say, well, I exported all that to some common format. I just re-import it from that separate file that I've got, and I at least get back to things as they were on the day when I made that particular export.
Do you know what, Paul? What I was just thinking while you're talking about it, the big point that you've just made for me is, if you're doing backups, think about it first, rather than just blindly, drag and drop and tick backups done.
Yeah, I know. I'm not a backup expert, but I did once completely trash a system, thankfully in a lab at work. And the whole idea of having a lab is you can tear it down and rebuild it, which I had to do simply because I encrypted an NTFS partition, and the bloody encryption key got lost, or something went wrong that stopped me decrypting that disk. And so, having been through this process of and I found, of course, the backup was encrypted with the same key. So it was one of those things that, again, actually, I didn't mention this earlier. Again, you need to think about, if you're doing encrypted backups, are you absolutely sure you've got the right password and you've got a separate copy of that somewhere? Particularly now, as things are going into passphrases and things, which aren't things that you can easily enter on a keyboard.
Yeah, yes, more good points there. What I'm going to do, I can see three hands up. I'm going to go to the next slide first, and then come to some questions. So this is just an example of 321. So this is a MacBook because we've got Time Machine. If you're not aware, if you don't have Mac, Time Machine is built into Macs, and you plug in a drive, you click on an icon, and it automatically does these snapshot backups to your external drive. And I know there's Windows apps that does exactly the same thing. I'm not focusing on Macs particularly, but it's just what I'm aware of. So this particular backup plan, everything this guy does on his desktop is backed up to his drive here. Using Time Machine, so he's automatically got this history of backups on this drive, but also he's using a separate tool to back up to a cloud. So you can see here he's got 3 copies of the data. He's actually got 3 different medias, not 2, so he's over. And he's got 1 cloud backup. And I think this is a typical backup scheme for most people. You have a drive, plug it into USB and unplug it to give you a air gap when you're not doing your backups, and you have a second backups to a cloud, whether it's iCloud or Google Drive or something else which is off-site. Right, so I've got some hands up. So Seamus.
Yes, just a couple of quick comments. One is some of the image backup programs will take care of incremental backups, and things like running programs, etc., that do that automatically. You just have to set the settings up and you're good to go. The other point that I think is easy to do is I have a solid state drive on my machine as well as conventional disks. And I just write a script so that important files like my email file and any updated financial data gets written to the SSD by the script every night.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's also straightforward things that can be done.
Yeah, a good point there about automated stuff. So if you do backups manually, you're going to forget and you're going to get fed up. So you use a tool or write a script, as you say, to automate them as much as you can. But the thing is, and we will cover this, if you automate it, you've still got to detect when things go wrong.
Absolutely.
If your script has failed for months on end, it's no good finding that out when you need to restore something. Tom.
Yeah, I'm glad you just made that point, actually, because that's a crucial point, and it's a real challenge right now. For about 15 years, I've received an email from my own PC, my daughter's PC, and my son's PC when he was away at university, confirming the backups. So, and when there's if there's a failure code returned, then you get the full log in the email. So I was monitoring mine and the kids, and they monitor their own because they get the email as well. But unfortunately, that system ran on Microsoft Hotmail, and Microsoft has recently, belatedly perhaps some would say, introduced some higher security. So the script, the simple program that I was using, which is send email, command line, kind of little bit of script code, it doesn't work on Microsoft anymore because of the changes they've made. And I've been trying to find a replacement. I temporarily have had a replacement using something on Google Mail. So I switched the account to Google Mail, and that was working fine until about last week. And then they've done something to their system. So I'm really struggling to find something that will send an automatic email report of a successful backup, or successful or worse, failed backup. So if anyone's got any ideas on that, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll do what I do with notifications a bit later.
Okay. The other thing is I use 2 backup, well, at least 2 backup systems. So I have an app that runs a backup, and I have a script that I pulled together about 15 years ago that runs a backup. So if something goes wrong with the app, the app runs in the evening, and my script runs in the morning. So one of them hopefully will still be working. So that's quite good. And then the other thing which I might mention is, of course, one way of dealing with certain computers, of course, is to run the system in a virtual machine, and that's ideal for Windows, for me anyway, because if one gets a virus or anything, you just delete the file, and 10 minutes later you're working from the backup.
Yep. Good points, Peter.
Okay, sorry about the delay. This is fascinating stuff. Most of the times I ever need a backup, like you said, is personal cock up. Okay, I've never, fortunately, had something nasty happen to me. And coupled with what you're talking about is this concept of versioning. We might cover that in a bit, actually, versioning. Now, I think Paul's given me quite an interesting idea, in as much as what he's saying exactly right. If you cock it up on your local copy, then it will get synced automatically to Gmail or iCloud or whatever you're using. And therefore, it's the personal cock up which is the biggest problem. Now, interestingly, I'm thinking to myself, do I want to occasionally do a sync from the iCloud or G Drive, Google Drive, onto a local drive, purely to really cater for the most common thing, which is a cock up by myself? All the other stuff I think it's unlikely to happen most of the time. I might be just over egging it. So Paul's given me the idea, which I think is an interesting idea, is do I somehow back up iCloud or G Drive to a local media on a relatively infrequent basis, once a month maybe, in which I need to guard against my own stupidity. That's an interesting concept there. I haven't really just thought about it. Thank you, Paul, for that idea. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, good thoughts, Peter. I'm glad this is triggering some thinking, because this is what it's all about today. If you do snapshot type backups, such as Time Machine on Macs and the equivalent on other operating systems, then you get that history of everything that you back up. So if you really screw things up today, then you just have a look at your backup that you made yesterday or the day before or last week or last month.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's it.
This history of backups, I think, these days is really quite useful. Paul?
Yeah, a couple of further thoughts. I've perhaps through laziness, but I've got in the habit, and I need to sort them out sometime, of keeping old machines. But what I do is I leave them as they are. I disconnect them from the internet, so it doesn't bother me that they're not kept up to date. And then I air gap critical files onto them. So in a sense, if I need to read or edit a document, I've always got, effectively, it's not a live hot backup, but it is a hot backup in the sense I can just start that machine up and carry on working on it. And I've used that from time to time. One of the things to be aware of, even if you do a full machine backup,
this is where
of your OS and everything, if your machine crashes and it's, say, a laptop where you can't easily change components, it's not a big machine you can get inside and replace a card or replace a drive, and this is particularly the case with Apple Gear. If you then buy a new unit, i.e. a new PC, you have the problem in that you'll probably find all the video drivers have changed and all the hardware's changed. So you might get sort of up and going from an original copy of the whole system, but you're going to have to make quite a few changes to get it working properly. I've found this on Windows machines in the past, that every single Windows machine that's shipped, even from the same manufacturer at the same time, seems to be built from different hardware, and that causes problems with a restore, from what you thought was a good backup. It's a good backup. It's just that the new machine you're backing it up onto or restoring it onto to replace the old machine is built differently to what the previous one was. Just something to be aware of.
Yeah, the other issue I've seen along those lines, Paul, I mean, I don't deal with Windows these days.
No, me neither. Except for fixing other people's machines.
Yeah, but with Windows, certainly in the past, I found that the operating system seems to be licensed to a particular physical disk.
It is, yeah.
So if the disk fails and you plug a new disk in and try and restore it, it doesn't actually boot.
No, I have found though, yeah, it's happened to me twice, sorting out other people's boxes, and I did, and this was a couple of years ago, but I did find Microsoft were very, very helpful in terms of getting you a new license key that got you going and things like that, if you had a genuine case. What they're really worried about is people copying it and giving it not just to their brother and their mother, but, you know, giving it to lots of people and either selling it to make money or you know, it's the mass copying they were more bothered about than, you know, people just having a spare copy on a box you don't run very often in your own home kind of thing.
Okay, good. Thank you, Paul. So we've got a second video to watch now. So I'm going to play this, and then I'm conscious of time, so I'll probably push on a bit further and describe what I do, with perhaps some questions and discussions at the end.
This is my NAS. This is where I put all my video projects and a whole lot more. For a long time, I just had one copy of everything. That's not great. If there was a fire, all my data would be gone. Or what if Redshirt Jeff pulled one of my hard drives and ramset a nail through it? Dramatic, I know, but in either case, the data would be toast. So now I have a backup. And actually, I have more than one. Backups aren't just when you plug in a hard drive and copy stuff to it. If you're doing it that way, you're doing it wrong. You might be saying, Jeff, all my photos are in the cloud and I do all my email spreadsheets and stuff online. My stuff's already backed up. Wrong. First, the cloud is just someone else's computer. And second, you still need backups. And to tell you why, let's start with the basics. 1, 2, 3. Well, it's a tiny bit more advanced than that. It's the same thing, but backwards. Any data you care about should be backed up following a 3-2-1 backup plan. You should have 3 copies of all your important data. 2 of those copies should be on different storage media, and at least 1 of those copies should be off-site, somewhere physically distant. If you're relying on Google Drive or iCloud or something like that, that's just 1 copy. You should still have 2 more copies if you want to be safe. But what's important data? Is it this scan of an old essay about computers from when I was in grade school? Is it this old picture of my dad teaching me how to ride a bike from the 80s? Well, important data is subjective. It's different for everyone. But I'm sure you have some things like family photos or important documents that you care about. If you want to make sure you don't lose those files, you need to cover all 3 parts of the 3-2-1 backup plan. And if you think you're somehow covered by using fancy RAID setups or ZFS snapshots on a single storage array, you're not. Repeat it after me. RAID is not a backup. RAID is helpful in many cases, especially if you have a huge amount of data to store, but it doesn't matter if you have a NAS in RAID 10 or something like that. It still only counts as 1 copy, and you need 2 more to be safe. I'm going to show you how I back up all my data, and hopefully you can get some inspiration for ways to improve your own backups. The most important thing I did before I bought my NAS was I took an inventory so I knew what I was going to back up and how much storage space I needed. All my data can be lumped into 6 categories: photos, music, documents in my Dropbox, local files outside my Dropbox, all my open source projects, and finally, my massive video library. For each category, I follow the 3-2-1 backup plan. My photo library with over 70,000 raw files is more than a terabyte. I have thousands of files from paid photo shoots and thousands more of my growing family, so the library is priceless to me. I store 1 copy on my Mac locally with all the original photos. Another copy is on my NAS via Time Machine backup, and the 3rd remote backup is to my iCloud photo library. Some people hate it, but the convenience of something like Apple or Google's cloud library, assuming you have an iPhone or Android, is life-changing. In terms of trust, I know I'll get some sour comments, but I've been using iCloud since it was iTools and lived through the horrible abomination known as MobileMe. But you know what? Because I also keep at least 2 other backups, I've never lost an image. Moving on to my music library, I have a lot of independent and children's music that isn't on Apple Music or Spotify. I use Apple's iCloud Music Library and iTunes Match and have all the original files on my Mac and a Time Machine backup to be safe. I keep important files like old schoolwork and business documents in my Dropbox. That's all stored locally on my NAS via Time Machine and on Dropbox in the cloud. And for anyone about to comment about how I should try out Nextcloud, don't worry, it's in the works. I haven't been too impressed with Dropbox over the past few years. Some other local files are only backed up on my NAS via Time Machine, and they're not on the cloud. So there's a small hole here, but it's only temporary since most of those things are things like OS images that I could re-download. My open source projects are a little more complicated. Almost all of them are on my Mac since that's my main workspace. And that's backed up to my NAS via Time Machine, but I don't have every project on my Mac. Even if I did, my Mac might not always have the latest code since I don't do all my work on my main Mac. So I have a separate backup on my NAS that uses GitHub. Cool aside, GitHub was created by GitHub user Cooper Spencer after he saw me tweeting about code backups. It was really cool to see this nice, flexible, open source Git backup tool created just from that tweet. So now I have one copy on my Mac, another copy guaranteed to be up to date on the NAS, and a third copy, the source of truth, on GitHub. Finally, I have all my video content. After this channel started blowing up last year, backing up all my video projects got a lot more important. And I went from maybe having 10 or 20 gigabytes of video a year to having 5 terabytes this year. So once I put this new NAS in service, I got more serious about backups. I usually had 2 copies of most things before, but they were spread out over a bunch of hard drives with no automation or documentation. But that's all changed. Now I have 1 copy on my primary NAS, a synchronized copy on a backup NAS, and a third copy in the cloud. And that's coordinated through this Raspberry Pi, my backup Pi. I back up over 6 terabytes of data to AWS Glacier using rclone. rclone's an open source tool for synchronizing stuff to and from any cloud storage provider like Backblaze, Google, or AWS. I store my backup in Glacier because it's cheap, like really, really cheap. I pay $4 a month to back up 6 terabytes. Now, before you rush to the comments, I know restores with Glacier can take a while to start and they cost more since they're offline. But you got to remember, the Glacier backup is for major emergencies only. Things have to be pretty bad, like a nuclear attack, a burned down house, or a Red Shirt Jeff rampage, before I need to use it. But back to the Pi. It also runs GitHub, and the Pi logs everything so I can make sure backups are running. There are 1,000 other ways to implement a good backup plan, and great software like Restic, Arc, Borg, and CrashPlane. I'm a video maker and developer, so my plan is probably a lot different than yours. Maybe you could just get by with 2 external hard drives, rotating them out in a remote location for the third copy. But people tend to have a lot of data nowadays. Maybe that's you. Instead of relying on a pre-installed backup app or manual single drive backups, you should take a data inventory, write up a real backup plan, and use robust backup tools to make sure you're covered top to bottom. For my plan, I created this open source repo, and it has my entire plan and includes all the automation I use for my backups. Even if my whole network rack got nanosnapped out of existence right now, I'd be okay since everything's backed up and documented and almost everything's automated. But my plan's not perfect. An important counterpart is a disaster recovery plan. For a lot of my data, I kind of wimp out and say, I'll cross that bridge if I ever need to. But you know the worst possible time to test a disaster recovery plan? In the middle of a disaster. If my house burns down, I have to ask, how long would it take before I could be productive again, at least in terms of my data? Would it take a day? A week? The only way to really know is to make a plan and test the plan. And I've only done a little of that. To truly rest easy, you have to have great backups following a 3-2-1 backup plan and test your recovery process. I still have other holes in my plan too. Some devices like my network router and switches have custom configurations that aren't automatically backed up. It's hard to automate configuration or backups for most consumer networking gear, but I can always do better, and I think that's the theme with backups. You can almost always do better than you are right now. I hope something in this video helped you fill a hole in your own plan. If you're not backing up anything at all, at least go buy a hard drive and back up your computer. Windows has backup and recovery, macOS has Time Machine, and Linux has, well, a lot of different options, but most of them are easy to use. And if you're already using a hard drive or NAS, maybe also back up to a cloud service or rotate out 2 backup drives. We can all improve our backups. It's a never-ending journey. The key is to find a place you're comfortable. I'll conclude by saying there are 2 types of people in this world. People who have lost important data before and people who will lose important data. In both cases, people with a good backup plan sleep easier at night. That is, unless they have a nightmare about Red Shirt Jeff running around with a nail gun. But anyways, until next time.
Right. So that's that video. What I'm thinking about doing now is I think I'm just going to plow on to the end, and so we have some more follow-on questions and discussions at the end. We've talked about this before, so if you've got running applications, you might need to handle them differently. So, particularly if you've got, applications got, 10 different files open, as a backup works through it, it's going to be a different point of time of those 10 files. And when you restore them, you're going to get a slew, an out of sync backup. Easy thing is stop your applications for backup. Use a application specific tool that will export the data. so that if you have to restore, you just restore that file rather than the core database. Or, these days, particularly tools from Microsoft and Apple, they are aware of the core running application, so you don't really need to think about it too much. But even so, if you're using Time Machine on your Mac, Time Machine knows about email and all your Mac applications will back them up cleanly. You install your genealogy program, and Time Machine may not know how to handle that system safely. So even then, you might think about stopping your applications before your backups run. We talked last month about Image, which is the Google Photos replacement, and I made the same point about backups, which is part of the reason why we're doing this today. Image is now, since last month, they've had a patch to it, and now that does a daily export of the database. So that's a bit that you need to back up if you use that. And tools like WordPress, which we run, WordPress runs our U3A communities. It's got lots of different plugins that again will export the website to a file, and you back up that file. So if the server crashes, you've got your backups. You install WordPress again, and then you restore from those exported files. And I'm just going to list a few random tools. This is not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination. So we mentioned Time Machine a lot. Now, if you've not seen it, Time Machine just runs in the background. And if you want to restore it, you get this like three-dimensional view of your desktop, and you can scroll backwards and forwards and restore any file from any point in time. Windows has got Windows backup built in, similar sorts of tools. We've got cloud-based backup, Arc and CrashPlan, and so on and so forth. And as the guy on the video was saying, cross-platform, including Linux, there's lots of tools. rsync is often used in tooling. rsync is a simple tool that makes copies to directories over the network between two machines, and it works on Windows and Macs and Linux and so on. Restic, which I'm going to cover a bit later, which is a bit like Time Machine, but it's cross-platform. Copier is another. As offline IMAP is an interesting one, and I use that to back up my email. And I'll describe what I do with that in a minute. And rclone is another useful tool if you want to back up to the cloud or from the cloud. rclone is a nice little tool that kind of can fit in between your standard desktop backup tools and the cloud. So, pulling all this together, this is what I do. And as I said at the beginning, just because I do it doesn't mean that you should do it. I'm just trying to explain that I've taken these concepts of 3, 2, 1 and snapshots and so on, and I put it together into a plan which I've mostly got working now. I've got one or two things to finish. So at home, I've got my MacBook, which is what I've got, which I'm using now. That needs to be backed up. I've got my Home Assistant server. I've got my Garden Camera server. I've got my web server. I've got my phone. And these are the original data. So, I've got one copy of my data already. Now, what I've done is I've got an old Raspberry Pi, and I've attached to the Raspberry Pi a big SSD disk. And what I'm doing is I'm using a tool called Restic. Now, Restic is a cross-platform version of Time Machine, and it will take snapshot backups according to your plan, copy your files over the network, and allow you to restore things pretty easily. And what I've done as well, I've built a second Restic server, which is not off-site at the moment, but this weekend I'm physically taking it to a friend's house. I'm going to plug it into their network, and then that gives me my off-site backup. And because there's a VPN server on there, I can access it anytime I like. So this is what my Restic backup physically looks like. I've got this little plastic rack thing, and this little server here is a old Raspberry Pi, which I'd lying around. and I've got this SSD over USB 3 cable, and that is my backup server. And so it doesn't have to cost a lot. You saw in the video these big racks of RAID disks. The Raspberry Pi was free because I had it already, but what are they? 30, 40 pounds. The external disk is the most expensive part, but then that gives you your little backup server. And what I've built as well is a remote backup server, which is this little box here. And if we look inside of it, it's actually an Odroid. And if you flip it over, it's got a little slot for an SSD built into it. So, it's just a little box that I can squirrel away in someone else's house, plug in power, plug in network, and then that's my offsite backup. So, most people use a cloud service, Google or iCloud site. I'm effectively building my own cloud server to have a second copy of my backups. And I've put a policy in place with Restic. Restic's very easy to configure your policy. So I'm keeping 7 daily snapshots, 5 weekly, 12 monthly, and you've got to give a configuration for yearly as well. So 75 yearly. The other things I'm doing is I'm taking copies of stuff that I store in cloud and downloading it to one of my servers. So things like my documents, this presentation is actually all on Google Cloud. And if, as Google tends to do, they could discontinue services or accidentally delete stuff. So every night I actually copy stuff from Google, various different Google services, onto my server here, and then I can back it up onto my backup server right at Restic. And I use rclone to do that. And likewise, I take my email and use offline IMAP to take a copy of my email. I'm one of these people who thinks email is an important resource of data. Other people see it as transient. So I take a backup. The nice thing about taking a second backup of email rather than what you're doing desktop, you've not got any running applications. You've not got any backup SKU to worry about. And my backup script is a one-liner. We just run restic command and that's it. So it's actually pretty simple to set up, although it is in the Unix sense of things, it's primarily a command line tool with user interfaces a second. This is a user interface. There are several different ones you can choose, and this is Restic browser. You can pretty much like Time Machine. You can look up through your different backups and dates, and you can scroll back in date and you can see what files you've got at each date, and you can do searches and you can list your backups and so on. And I also use Home Assistant. We talked about Home Assistant. So what I do for alerting, we talked about alerting, all the backup statuses I push to Home Assistant. So at a glance here, I can see the most recent backups. I've got status, I've got timestamps, I've got servers I'm backing up, directories and sizes. And that means that if anything goes wrong or a backup isn't running, I can arrange Home Assistant to send me a message. That's it really. So that's what I do. Restic for me is a core technology choice that I've made. And a few other random thoughts just to wind up before we have any other discussions. Consider encrypting backups. We had the point earlier that if you encrypt things, don't lose your encryption key. But if you think you're backing up financial information and your backups are going onto some cloud that you've got no control over, you really need to make sure that no one can access that financial information that shouldn't access it. Most tools these days, in fact, pretty much all of them will compress your backups by default, and that can save a surprising amount of disk space. Now, I had some fun and games with Google Photos, and I don't know if other photographic systems work this way. But if you go to Google Photographs and download a picture, you don't get the same picture that you uploaded. You get information stripped from it. And so the only way with Google Photographs to get back your original files is to use Google Takeout. And then that takes, probably an overnight for Google to generate this file. You download it, and then you've got your original pictures again. So this is actually one of the reasons why I moved to Image that we talked about last month. And references. And finally, I'll wrap up. You see in my backdrop, I have Glastonbury Festival. I'll stop sharing now, actually. I shall tell you a quick story about Glastonbury Festival. The first time I went to Glastonbury Festival, being it's not the most cleanest environment you're going to visit. First time visiting Glastonbury, taking lots of pictures everywhere. I went to unlock my phone without doing a backup of my pictures, and my phone didn't recognize my fingerprint, and it deleted all my pictures and reset itself. So when I go to these events now, I'll always have the photographic sync to cloud on, so that if something happens to your phone, you've still got a backup of your pictures. So that's one reason why I've got Glastonbury on my backdrop today. Right, so I've gone through everything that I planned to go through. I'm sure there's lots of additional comments to be had. Now I can see some stuff going on in chat. Paul made a point about end-to-end encryption. Yep. Yeah, a good point about printing key documents. So most of us, I would say, use a password manager to manage all our hundreds and thousands of different passwords. So that database of your passwords is a key thing to back up, but also the password to unlock your password manager is a piece of key information. And in fact, people are now putting the passwords for your password manager, attach it to your will, so that people can access all your online resources if the worst should happen. Something else to bear in mind, backups for doing any major updates. Very good point, Paul. Thank you. Seamus, got another point.
A couple of minor ones, yes. In terms of considering what you want to back up, it's also worth considering what the files that you're never going to want to see again, but you don't want to discard. Photographs of your ex-wife, for example, or something like that. And what I do is every now and then I'll have about 50 to a couple of hundred gigs of files that I'm going to archive. I will burn those to optical media, and then they will probably outlast me. And if, God forbid, anyone ever wants them again, I can recover them. And meanwhile, they just sit in the garage somewhere. So that's, that's an easy way to archive old files that you don't want to throw away, but you want to get them off your computer. The other thing too is just in terms of all this stuff about the cloud, it's probably worth keeping in mind that, there are tens of thousands of, if not hundreds of thousands of households in the UK still that don't have access to decent broadband. If you live on one of the Scottish Highlands, as I do, and the gentleman there from the Isle of Mull, fast broadband is a distant dream. Which makes, a lot of the cloud resources very difficult to use in any meaningful sense. And so local systems, local backups becoming correspondingly more important.
Yep, good points. Well made as ever. David.
Oops, hi. So I use the 321, but I base everything around rsync. Yep. And effectively open file standards. So one aspect of that is that the final backup is a full copy, and it's a USB drive. So I air gap to USB to do the backup that way. But by using the standard files and a USB drive, it means that if my main PC goes, I can literally plug it into another PC, and I have full access to the files as they were backed up. So I guess the summary of that is when you looking at backups, you need to think about whether you're exposing yourself to proprietary backup applications and proprietary data formats, because it's no good having 10 years of backed up data if all of a sudden you can't access it because you haven't got the app or access to the app anymore.
Yeah, I mentioned that quite early about WordStore and such like, trying to restore that. You might want to look at, David, Restic, because I see it as like one up from rclone and such like. I find it quite a nice little tool.
Yeah, well.
Oh,
yeah, just a couple of things. I've had issues with in the past, having kept a copy of an old spreadsheet, finding I couldn't open it in the latest version of either Windows or Apple or whatever, and because I hadn't checked it for a while and there was something that was incompatible that wouldn't work. One thing to be aware of if you are printing key documents, I always plug in a USB cable and turn off the Wi-Fi, because there's no guarantee that your comms between your box and your printer are encrypted, which means if you're printing a sensitive financial document, anybody within range of your house, which is quite a few houses, could in theory be reading that traffic, particularly if it's an oldish printer. I'm not convinced that they encrypt it, and I've tried to find out even from HP, and they don't tell you on the website, they don't tell you on the box, and they don't tell you in the manual either. The final thing is a question, Peter. It's in terms of hardware media, there's external drives, there's memory sticks, and then there's SD cards, and you can get quite large sizes in all of them now. Is it just really the speed that you're buying when you buy these things? You pay a lot more for an SDD 1 terabyte drive than you would for a 1 terabyte memory stick, for instance. Is it really just the speed that's the what you're paying for now?
Yeah, a lot of these SSD, these M.2 SSDs, which I showed you a picture of, are made to fit into gaming consoles, PlayStations and such like, and in that environment, speed is absolutely key. However, there's lots of different price points and speeds available. And for me, I've gone to SSDs not because of speed particularly, but because they're quiet and small. There's no spinning disks, and they're likely to last. I will give a warning though. I've been through some failures with SSD, partly buying from AliExpress where they've arrived and they've been fakes.
Yeah.
Or buying from Amazon and they failed on first use. So, and this comment will apply to any device. There are tools available that when you buy a USB stick or an SSD drive, you can plug it in. You can run these tools that will test them out. Firstly, to they're fake or not. They're actually a 1 gigabyte stick, and they appear to be a 1 terabyte stick or something like that. They'll test the capacity is what's advertised, and secondly, they'll do a read-write test of the whole device. So don't start using such a drive until you've verified that it's not genuine and it actually will survive at least one read-write cycle across the whole drive.
Yeah, I've had similar problems buying from Amazon, because Amazon nowadays is a marketplace and it's not always sourced from Amazon or directly from the manufacturer. A thing to be aware of, I think, with SSDs is that a bit like on the old hard drives, they mark bad sectors effectively, and if they're bad, they just get written out of what is effectively what is now the replacement for what used to be the file access table. So you know what sectors you can write to, or the operating system does. And I have heard that some of them can be quite not best quality, as it were, when you buy them. So what I always do with a new disk is I make a copy of any software that might be on the disk that I might need later, like drivers, and then I completely reformat and reflash it, because that's another way of getting around viruses or the fact that the disk might have been returned back to the store as unused, but it's not unused, if you see what I mean. Because if you got a virus on that disk, and at one stage Dell was shipping computers with viruses, you're screwed right from the start, because your backup is virus right from the start.
Yep. Yep. More good points. Tom.
Sorry, yeah. While I've got you on the call, because I think you seem to know an awful lot about the Linux system, I've just switched to using yesterday BTRFS, which is described as a copy on write, and I've no idea yet. It came up today on one of the presentations, but I don't really get the hang of that yet. Just wonder if you got anything to share.
It's not a file system type that I actually use. I've been through a few different file systems. I think it is the default on some distributions now. I say I don't use it, but yeah, it's designed for these kind of like backup type stuff as far as I understand it. But I don't know too much about it. I mean, it might be a subject for a future talk, I guess. The different file system types. I mean, I think this is true for BTRFs. They have a snapshot function at the file system level, which can be really nice if you're running, web servers and so on. Is what you can do is you've got a running web server, you can issue the snapshot command, and then on the file system, you've got instantly a copy of your web server in a different directory or whatever. Your web server is still running and the files are still being updated, and you've got this snapshot, and the file system then maintains this directory. It's actually a series of hard links, effectively, and you can back that up slowly at your leisure, as if you actually frozen your whole system. So yeah, file systems can give you this extra way to do snapshots if you don't have a separate tool to do it with mystical low-level features.
Can I just just mention one thing? On this rebuild I've done, I did discuss with the supplier of the components about maybe getting an SSD, and they told me don't bother because the modules are 10 times faster and actually cheaper than SSD for bulk storage.
Yeah, speed is debatable, but yeah, certainly traditional disk drives are now cheaper than SSDs. That is very true. You get some very big drives. So bear in mind,
I mean the modules that you put directly into your motherboard.
Oh, right.
NVMEs.
Yeah.
They're 10 times faster, and they're actually cheaper than an SSD. It's just not if you.
You're talking about flash drives.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You get lots of different types of SSDs. I mean, I'm sticking to M2 format, which is the same as on my desktop and on all my little servers, little tiny stick type things. Some of my servers have got a little tiny, almost proprietary SSD, which you can program outside and then plug it onto the main board, and that'll be its boot partition. That's kind of quite unusual, I suppose. All right. I'm just wondering if we come to a natural end. Yeah, we're past our 9:30. Go on, David. You're muted.
Yeah, I had something pop up in front. Just a quick, I guess, advert for Linux. There's been some comments about backing up the boot disk. With Linux, you can if you basically keep the boot drive separate from your data drives, which is what I do. If that machine fails, for example, you can take that boot drive and you can plug it into any other computer if it's hardware compatible, and you can reboot up the Linux. You don't have to worry about drivers. And that's one of the endearing features, if you will, of Linux. I verified that by accident when I plugged the wrong SSD into my laptop, and it came up as if it was my desktop. And then I realized what was happening. So the point there is that I have multiple machines in the house, but they all use SSD, M.2 SSDs for the boot disk. And so if any of the machines fail, I could literally take the boot drive out of one of the other machines, plug it into that machine, and then back up again.
You can also plug into these sorts of little devices. Our backgrounds get in the way. Putting the yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're accessible in the sense that you can flash them outside of your main system.
Yeah, I use SSD now, the M.2s in place of SD drives.
Yep.
So that's what that's for. Oh, the other comment, I don't trust the cloud, so I don't use cloud for backup or permanent storage. I'll use it for ephemeral data like sharing in place of a USB drive, but that's basically it.
So are you going to do your one in 321, your offsite
Sorry, say
copy?
again?
Are you going to do your offsite copy?
Oh, I just take the USB drive. It's an 8 terabyte drive, and I just take it offsite.
Oh, right.
I air gap it and then carry it. So I use SneakerNet.
Very good, very good. Peter.
It's not Peter. Quick question. I'm a bit confused. What will be the hardware link between a Pi and some terabyte of data? Because I've heard M2, NVMe, and obviously SD card. Is there a solution for just a pure hardware link between a Pi and hardware backup, please, Peter?
Yeah, let me share my little pictures here again.
Have you got a serial or parallel link out to the Pi?
No, I'll show you the pictures here. So I've got this is a Raspberry Pi here, and I showed you a picture. It's not very clear, to be honest, but the Raspberry Pi is this guy here in the slot.
Oh, it's got Ethernet on it. Yeah,
it's got Ethernet on it, but it's also got a USB 3 cable to the this thing here, and that in there is my M2 SSD card, same as what David was holding up. And
you use USB to M3. Is that what you do?
In this case, yes.
Okay.
And USB 3 is pretty damn fast,
Yep, okay.
It's USB used to be quite slow for disks, and you'd only do it when you had to do it. But USB 3 and USB 4 really, the USB will run faster than your disks.
Okay.
And for my remote backup, I use this thing called an Odroid M1S, which is similar to Raspberry Pi. But it's cheap, first of all, which is always good, which means it's a little bit on the slow side. But if you flip it over on the back, it's got a little connector for your M.2, and this here is the SSD disk.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, as a cloud backup, you're pointing me in the direction of Restic. Have a look at Restic, is that right? As a cloud backup.
What I've done in the references there, I've got a link to Restic. It's what I use,
Okay, fine.
What I would say to anyone listening to this is, hopefully today, if it's done nothing, it's all right. Right, I'm going to think about my backups a little bit more. I'm going to think about where my holes are and how I want to fill it. What I'm not saying is that everyone here should use Restic.
No. You've got to have a starting point. If you're going to iterate, you must have a good iteration at the start rather than the off the bat. And Restic sounds like a good starting point. The other thing is, I do use Macromedia, which is a cloning mechanism. I've got a PC, and I do use that. Just literally copy the disk occasionally, which is pretty good at cloning. Disadvantage, you have to have disk exactly the same number of gigabytes, actually. Okay. And the other thing which is knocking around in my mind, I'm a bit. I know Google Drive has versioning in it, doesn't it? Now, versioning is quite useful. I've never really got to grips with it. I don't know. At some point, we might want to talk about that. It is an interesting concept because it's called configuration management, and it can get really complicated. But from what we said today, we need to think very carefully what data we got and how valuable it is, and how we maybe on each type of data we think on a slightly different backup strategy, because that was very interesting. Okay.
Yeah, but what you said last, I think, is exactly it. But lots of cloud services and file system do support versioning. So on Google Drive, you can see one single file there.
Yeah.
With more information, you can actually see the history of that single file.
Yeah.
So you can go back in time if on that one single file. So that might be useful. If you're running like I do, running a web server, that versioning can be quite useful. So you got a web page, you don't want to edit it and then I've got to restore from backup now. You just go back to the previous version. Same in word processing and all the rest of it. But yes, file systems can support versioning.
I think versioning is quite an important concept to have, especially if you do, like I make mistakes quite frequently, and you can't always click go back a step button on the software. That's the problem. Okay, thanks a lot for the presentation again. Thank you.
I think what you want to look at, Peter, is some sort of snapshot-based backup systems. If you only Macs, then the obvious choice is Time Machine.
Yeah.
You use lots of different types of operating system, then you probably want to look at something cross-platform. Because what I tend to do is, I've got a Mac that I'm using in front of it. I've got lots of Linux servers, but I quite often restore files that were backed up on Linux on my Mac, because I want to look at them with a text editor or whatever. So cross-platform for me is quite important.
Yeah, I have the same issue. I do a bit of Python development, and it's nice to go between the machines sometimes, just for testing purposes. Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
All right. We've got no other hands up, no other comments. Anything else for anyone else before we sign off? So we've got a forum online. And this sort of topic, backups, might be a very good topic to throw at the forum, if you want to ask questions or give more details about how you're running your backups. And, the forums online is there. Oh, damn, I forgot to mention this. I should mention before everyone left. At U3A Communities, we will be announcing a new group on the forum, on the websites. And it's called Improving Legislation. So it's a legal-based group. And that announcement will probably go out this evening. So if anyone here is interested in the law, that'll be another group on U3A Communities you might want to sign up for. And I won't announce it yet, but we have plans for a further new group in the new year. So, if you signed up, you obviously signed up to U3A Communities. You'll get an email, hopefully today, about the first new group and an email in the new year about the second new group. So if you're interested in these topics, just subscribe to the email lists and then you'll get notified when the meetings are. I should have made that earlier, but I forgot. There we go. That's life. Anything else for anyone else, or do we close there?
I can't think of anything you've missed, Peter. It's pretty thorough.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for turning up.
You.
We'll see you next month.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. Much appreciated.
Yeah,
Bye.
great. Thanks, Peter. Brilliant.